if you've got space to write, I want you please now just to write for 1 minute what that is. I want you to tell me the story of what that is. Have a look at that slightly bizarre picture. It's one of my first holiday snaps from Iceland. Put your creative juices to work. My, what a compliant class. There's your minute up. You haven't finished writing, I know. But just share with your neighbour your idea, your rough idea, in summary. And that'll do you. A lot of what I want to do this morning is just to give you a sample of the sorts of activities I'm going to be running in teaching burial rites. Just as a disclaimer though, I realised this morning this is my little nightmare, I guess, Julie, of things that I didn't contemplate enough perhaps, as I'd forgotten burial rites is on the list as one of those external assessment ones as well. The majority of what I'm talking about this morning is focused on it as a novel study leading up to a creative writing task. But there's a lot in there, of course, just about the understanding, the comprehension, the depth of the characters and stuff that would be applicable as well, and that'll be obvious as we go through. This is not a giant aero bar, as I first wanted it to be. It's Dvergestone. It's the dwarf stone. And these holes are the tunnels that the dwarves use as their access from the underworld come nightfall. It's in Seyðisfjörður on the east coast of Iceland. We're going to see lots of these funny looking letters and odd sounding words, which I get kind of right sometimes. Don't be intimidated by that in the text, the students are not going to know any better anyway. There's a guide to pronunciation at the front, and just make it up and see how it goes. Or get the audio version and hear some professionals who have practiced it.
The audio version has beautiful pronunciation.
I choose this as my sort of introduction to Iceland because Iceland is such a distinctive and alien place physically. The geography is amazing. The inland stuff is just brutal and barren. It was used by the Apollo astronauts for training as the most similar environment they could find to the lunar landscape. But it's full of this sort of thing and the stories behind it. Iceland is full of folklore. Icelandic culture is full of folklore. They're very proud of it, and it's still part of their modern life. Not that they believe in trolls and dwarves, but the stories are still there, and lots of superstition, particularly when we rewind back to the 1820s, when we've got burial rites being set in. That sort of stuff, it's not necessarily foregrounded, it's not in the story itself, but the characters are all aware of it and steeped in it. Okay, so we're about 2/3 have read the book, about 1/3 of us haven't touched it or are meaning to, that's fine. Þeim var ég verst ég unimest. It's from Gudrun and Laxdæla saga, one of the four major family sagas from the 13th century, which is my real passion with Iceland. It's where my academic background was. And Gudrun is a woman who married 4 different men over the course of the saga, and she's a historical character. And she ended up basically having them killed, or various things happened. Some of them died of their own accord, but she was asked by her son, this is one of the in the last chapter I think, mother, which of the 4 men did you love most? And she didn't answer it directly because they don't answer anything directly in Icelandic sagas. They talk in these cryptic sort of terms, these epigrams. I was worst to the one I loved the most. And that's what Hannah Kent uses as well to set up burial rites for us. So it's a story of Agnes Magnusdóttir. She's convicted of murdering her lover. And she's not only convicted, she's condemned. It's 1820s Iceland. There's not really much in the way of central government. It's all outsourced. They're a colony nowadays of Denmark. That's the ultimate authority, the king back in Copenhagen. There are no jails. Might have been if she was in Reykjavik down south, but she's up in the north. in the North Districts there are no jails, there are no social institutions. So she's billeted with a family until she's to be executed. That's a great concept, it's a great setup for a story, and based on a true story as well. Billeted with that family, and she's assigned a confessor as well to help bring her to redemption perhaps. So let's just read. As an introduction for those of you who haven't tasted it yet, or a refresher for those, and it's just the prologue, it's the very first thing on page 1, but I think it captures enough. You know, when I first started reading this over the Christmas holidays, I'd already said that I was going to try teaching it and present here. I should read the book now. This first page was enough to convince me. The fact it was about Iceland was enough for me to buy in. But this first page made me think, okay, there's going to be enough here. They said I must die. They said that I stole the breath from men, and now they must steal mine. I imagine then that we are all candle flames, breezy bright, fluttering in the darkness and the howl of the wind, and in the stillness of the room I hear footsteps, awful coming footsteps, coming to blow me out and send my life up away from me in a grey wreath of smoke. I will vanish into the air and the night. They will blow us all out one by one until it is only their own light by which they see themselves. Where will I be then? Sometimes I think I see it again, the farm burning in the dark. Sometimes I can feel the ache of winter in my lungs, and I think I see the flames mirrored in the ocean, the water so strange, so flickered with light. There was a moment during that night when I looked back. I looked back to watch the fire, and if I lick my skin, I can still taste the salt, the smoke. It wasn't always so cold. I hear footsteps. There's enough there that makes me think this is going to be a great book to teach. All right, there's enough there that's going to intimidate any Year 12 student when they first open and say, what, is the whole thing like this? But, you know, we get some lovely foreshadowing in there as well. So it's a great prologue in that sense and a good preview of the reading. We can unpack a bit about that. Sometimes I think I see it again, the farm burning in the dark. So if the kids haven't had any exposure yet, then this is that real foreshadowing, and where we can stop and pause. That's the farmhouse that she burnt down with her stabbed lover lying in it. That maybe will appeal to them a bit more rather than the candle metaphor. Right. Here we go. Hannah Kent. What am I talking? What did I want to say? I'm not sure how Burial Rites matches up, okay? So I have taught Gatsby once, twice, 100 years ago. I did Brave New World for several years, and my latest favourite has been The Quiet American by Graham Greene. These are all fairly seminal texts, I think. You know, Gatsby, beautifully written, as part of that shared culture, that common literature that we have. Brave New World, at times I just think it's a terrible book. It's not very interesting, it's poorly written, but gee, it's important. And some really big ideas in there, in terms of what those students were saying about feedback or text selection. It provokes thought, it provokes discussion. So it's a worthy book, even if it's not, you know, terribly enjoyable. Quiet American, I don't know if it's going to count as important for anyone other than me in 50 years' time, another 50 years. But again, it's a beautiful book. And for me, particularly at Corinda, we've got a very large Vietnamese population. Quiet American is set in Vietnam in the 1950s. So it has that lovely rapport for our students. What I don't know is if Burial Rites is going to stack up in terms of importance, significance, or enduring quality. So I'll just put that out there. I'm not canning it. Hey, we've bought it. I'm going to teach it this year. And I enjoyed it as a book. I just don't know. It's still fresh. Will it still be good in another 10 years, another 20 years? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe if enough students get taught it in Queensland, they'll love it. It'll be part of our shared culture. My credentials, Dan Fallon is my name, but if I was in Iceland, I would be Daniel Eilensson, with the patronymic naming conventions they have in Iceland. There's only about 280,000 people live in the whole country. Microsoft doesn't bother producing a version in Icelandic, it's just not worth their while. And everyone in the Reykjavik phone book is listed there, and by their first names. And generations don't have the same familial name then, because it's based on their parents. So this is my mother's name, obviously, and I'm her son. So just share with your neighbour, please, who you are, but give yourself the patronymic or matronymic. You can basically choose your parents. It was generally the male, the father's name that was taken, but in some instances it would have been the mother's name. If the father was absent or the father was a criminal or an outlaw or something, then maybe they'd be known by their mother's name instead. My father wasn't an outlaw. Introduce yourself to your neighbour. Oh, if you're a woman, of course, you are not son, you are, I have no pens, Dottier, like Agnes Magnus Dottier. D-O-T-T-I-R. Dottier. Go, talk. And that'll do you. That's enough, Amy. All right. I guess credentials-wise, I've been teaching senior English for 15 years now. So I've seen a few books. I've taught a few kids. In terms of burial rites, so my expertise is that I love Iceland, particularly, as I say, the medieval Iceland. And more importantly, I've graduated with a diploma from Ishestur, which said that I can ride an Icelandic horse, for a tourist. And you mustn't call them ponies, all right? They're small, but they are horses. Okay, I'm going to structure this basically around how I'm planning my unit at the moment. So I've got a handful of pre-reading activities, some during reading activities, some post-reading, and then some time for some questions or some discussion at the end of that. So there's 4 things I want to share with you that I might do in the pre-read or at least in the very early reading stages of the novel. And the first one, now this is not going to work for you now because I've told you, some of you have read, most of you have read the book, I've told you a little bit about it anyway. What I'm going to do with my students on Monday morning who haven't read the book and know nothing about it at this stage, before I give them any sort of preview, is set them up with this sort of role play. So in pairs with your neighbour who you just introduced yourself to, I want you to split into A's and B's. A's, you're going to go stay with a family of strangers. That's all the information I'm going to give you. Your job now, to be a bit creative and a bit of role-playing building up to it, is to figure out why. And obviously we've got exchange students in our classes every now and then. They've got some idea of why these things might happen, but I want them to just imagine, be creative. And it really doesn't matter what they come up with. I just want them to be engaged in this scenario. You're going to go stay with another family, not your own kin. And what will that be like? The others, the B's, a stranger is coming to stay with your family. Why are they coming? And what's that going to be like? And obviously this forms a large part, particularly in the early stage of the novel, with that family at Cornsau and the daughters of the farmers in particular, and their different reactions to having the murderer living with them. So we won't do this one now, but we just play with that for a few minutes, come up with your ideas, talk about it, and then maybe share them back with the class so we can have a bit of a laugh, see what different groups have come up with, and then I would hit them with the context of, okay, well that person who's coming to stay with your family is a convicted murderer. How does that change your perceptions? Or if you thought it was going to be a little bit weird because that exchange student from Japan was coming, imagine if that exchange student is on death row in your house.
Excuse me, Dad, are you going to make your slides available
Sure.
for us?
Yep. Then how wrong is wrong? This one's on your handout. And we might play with this one just for a couple of minutes. What I'll do, there's a list of things there, a list of crimes, let's face it, or sins at least. Can you rank them? I think there's 13, maybe 12. Can you rank them from least bad to worst bad? Just do a handful if you like. Try and find the worst couple and the best couple. And see if your neighbours are agreeing or if you're radically morally different to your neighbours. Shocker. And I'll stop you there. You've got a taste for that. My apologies, I've just seen the typo, the poor editing there. The first one up there has no connection to the novel whatsoever. That's a hangover that I just forgot to delete. I use this as an introduction with Hamlet as well. I stole it originally from an introduction to Macbeth years ago from a school in England. And the number of crimes that occur in Shakespearean tragedies are beautiful, and it helps get some of that context thinking for them right. Is it worse to kill your brother or the king? Some of those sorts of things of distance. I don't think we get quite that sort of context setting with the crimes that are in Burial Rites, but I want them to be thinking about that murder and what the reasons for it might have been, the causes, the motivations, and the repercussions then. Because obviously the climax of the novel, but the whole point of the novel is this journey of Agnes. She is a convicted murderer, and she's going to be executed. There's death just before the novel, and there's death looming at the end of the novel, and it's that journey between these two deaths. And are they both murders? Is one of them justifiable? Are they both justifiable? Are neither of them? Is what leads me into my next activity. Once I've given a preview, maybe we've done a little bit of reading, the prologue, and maybe a bit of chapter 1, and established some of the characters and that context, what I then want is for the students to start asking questions. Before we've read the book, but now that we know what it's going to be about, what are the questions we want answered? And so some of these will be very simple. Some will be just those literal closed questions. Did she kill him? Okay, we'll write that one down and we'll keep that one for later. Is she evil? Are there any extenuating circumstances? Things that the students might want to ask, or even how did she do it? Did she have any accomplices? How did they find her? There's no jails, there's no police force. What happened there? There might be questions about the logic of it and about the plot, but what I really want to do is get them thinking a little bit deeper about it without knowing much at all, and going from very closed, very literal questions to more inferential questions and open questions, and hopefully all the way up to some good critical questions. So what I might be prompting is something like this, or modelling, why does Agnes choose Toti as her confessor? And I haven't introduced them for those who haven't read the book yet, but I'll come back to them in a moment. Her confessor, she had one originally assigned, but right at the start of the novel, the opening is about the new priest being assigned to her. And he's an assistant reverend or something they call him, is his title. And she has requested him specifically. And we don't find out why until midway through the novel. A more open question might be, what is her relationship with the confessor like? So we're going to need to do some reading and some understanding about that then. Or maybe what she hopes to achieve from having him. And maybe a more critical one then, broader beyond just this text. Does society have an obligation towards its condemned? So she has a confessor. Why has she chosen him? What's the relationship with the confessor like? Well, why does she even need a confessor? Does she deserve a confessor? What are they trying to achieve? Those sorts of things that we might build up some deeper questions to help their understanding of the novel as we go through. Even, quite frankly, if we don't answer those questions or discuss them, the very process of asking them at this stage before they read will hopefully set them up to understand a bit more. So we have some post-it notes on the tables. I would like you, please, to write me some questions. And so these can be my samples that I use on Monday morning. If you've read the novel, maybe think about things you didn't find resolved adequately or that you'd like to know a little bit more about, or put yourself back to that mindset of only in the beginning, what was I hoping to understand, or what did I want to find out? And if you haven't read it, then yeah, ask some questions. And they can be those literal closed ones if you like, and then we'll try and build from them. So what I would do is start with the literal questions and then model for the students that, hey, this is how we can shift them to open questions or to inferential questions and to critical questions. But for now, just write me some questions. My lesson yesterday was very similar to this, except we didn't touch the novel at all other than I gave them the context. It's set in Iceland, and they don't know very much about Iceland, so I got them to ask some of those questions. You know, we started, why is it called Iceland? Is it really cold there? You know, can you see the northern lights? And then got them to delve a little bit deeper into those sort of questions about some geography, some history, some culture, to do some background reading to set the geographical context for it and the historical context. And then we'll move on. So the last of my pre-reading samples that I've got for you is just some vocabulary work. Now, I'll come back to vocab later as well. There's lots of rich vocab Hannah Kent uses in this novel. But in particular, I've identified 12 terms I want my students to have a decent understanding of. Just that technical vocab, you know, not necessarily in context, before it comes up, in the novel. And this is actually their homework from last lesson, is to find their definitions for these. And then we're going to use that as our introduction, as a scaffold to our introduction and our preview for the novel. I find, you know, like most of us, I'm sure, I could just talk about this book for an hour and then the lesson's gone. And we're like, oh, I hope I gave you the right bits. Maybe next lesson. This is my guide then, in my previewing for them, to talk through it. So we know that Agnes is a pauper. All right, so she comes from that rural poverty background. Would it have been different if she was the daughter of a wealthy landowner? You know, we can use our definitions, our understanding, and its place in the context of the story to help ask some more questions and to probe a little bit more and to make connections between the ideas. She's condemned. Okay, if you don't know what that means, you're not going to understand most of this book. So we get that idea of looming death. Custodial, this is the relationship. Her placement in that farm with that family is not as a homestay student from overseas. It's not visiting family. It is custodial. Even though they're not guards, they have no official authority, she is a prisoner. The parish and the chaplaincy. We get lots of these words, you know, about religious institutions and structure that are just dropped in fairly casually, that probably aren't part of our students' everyday lives. So I just want them to understand that it's the parish records are kept by that priest, where they find out some of Agnes's backstory, and that Toti belongs to this network. Religion. Kinship is kind of important by its absence, at least for Agnes, Magnus' daughter, that her family, we understand, or is revealed as the novel goes through, are either dead or missing, or her father, she was never quite sure who that was. Whereas the family at Cornsow is quite tightly knit, even though they have their conflicts, you know, they have a very clear kinship network. And so we get that contrast. Paternalism. Certainly with regards to Agnes and how she's treated by the Icelandic community, what they're hoping to achieve. Chastisement is obviously what she's getting from the authority, such as it is in Iceland as well, and from individuals. Atonement and redemption is obviously the theoretical goal, at least. It's what Toti's trying to achieve for her. Reproach, we get many of them. I can't remember the exact context of that word in the book, but there's much reproach in there between characters and of the way they treat Agnes. And I find it's a really interesting book for that, the developing relationships among the other people based on their relationships with Agnes. And rites. You know, it's there in the novel. We need to understand what that means. It's all about these rituals, these prescribed behaviours. And I think that's great that it's there. I'll have to go back and reread. I'm pretty sure we never see the burial, but it's all leading up to a burial for Agnes and previously from Nathan. Okay, so I'll maybe delve into that a bit more with the students, obviously, and there'll be more discussion about the vocab itself and its meaning and placing it in context. But for them to come with some understanding of these definitions and then to have this broad picture going forward, they'd now be ready to read. So I'm going to show them a sociogram. We'll do a detailed read, really to focus on setting. We'll have a look at some artifacts and the vocab around that. I've got some ideas about voice and some more vocab work. Tolfin is just me showing off. It's the Icelandic word for 12. Well, it's the 12. The definite article is attached as a suffix to the end of words in. Tolf is 12, Tolfin is the 12 most important characters in the novel. So it's just a graphic for them. I'll put this up, explain who the characters are, or if we've done a little bit of reading, they can provide the input here. I'll either print them a copy or get them to draw this in their books or on their screens, but leaving room for notes about each of these characters as we go. So I'll give them the framework early on, so they've got a map of the web of relationships, and then as we read, we can start appending notes and quotes to it to get some richer detail and understanding. So Agnes is our murderess, our convicted murderess, and she's sent to live with Margaret. I struggle with some of these names in pronunciation when they're not historical Icelandic names, but the Icelandic convention is always to emphasize the first syllable. So to call her Margaret, it clashes with me, and I don't know if that's just a more modern convention or if there's a slightly different pronunciation I should be using. But anyway, Margaret and Jonsson, who we see very little of, really. It's a very female-heavy household, and the way that story is told. And their two daughters, Steina and Loiga. I'm not going to give you much background about them. Hey, half of you have read the book, but I would be for the students then, just to make sure they understand these relationships. And their servant, Christine. They're all off to one side. That's the family at Consell, where she's living in that custodial arrangement until her execution. Thorvaldr Jonsson. I sort of forget that his name is Thorvaldr. His nickname, and what we always hear him by, is Toti. He's her confessor, who she chooses. Okay, so there's that relationship in a slightly different direction. He's not her warden, he's her confessor. And his father is Reverend Jon, who gives him some fairly stern advice at times and a kick in the pants at times about what his role is as confessor, that he should be doing a better job to bring her back to God, and then begins to query just how obsessed his son has become towards the end of the novel. And Bjorn Blondel. He's fairly unlikable. I remember one scene at least where I thought he was fairly sympathetic, but I can't remember what it is. And the only things I remember from the novel are his really unlikable traits. He's the bigwig. He's the one who writes most of the letters we get throughout the novel saying, do this, take her into your household, get the axe ready, whatever it might be. He is the authority. Except he's got not much power either. He's always having to defer back to Copenhagen. Then we have Nathan Kettleson. Now there's a name I'm very confident of pronouncing because she tells us during the story. Still fairly early on, I think, but you've had a chance to read his name a few times and you're thinking, what sort of A is it in there? But it is Nathan, because they've just changed the S to an N from Satan. Thinking that he might have been Satan's son almost.
He's a good guy.
He is. Misunderstood. He's this strange, lonely farmer, herbalist, almost a magician maybe. But we never get into that realm of fantasy with him. But, the sort of guy who was around in rural Iceland in the 1820s. He's dead. We get him in flashback, obviously. But yeah, from the start of the story, he's dead. And I always find that an interesting concept in a novel where we know here's a key character, but they've already passed. We know their ending. We just don't know all the details about it. Nathan's also in a relationship with Sigurdur. Agnes doesn't find that out till a fair bit later. But Sigurd is also one of her accomplices, another convicted murderess. And then we have Fredrik Sigurdsson, who is the third member of the murdering party, also convicted and condemned. So I'd slow that down a little bit, make sure we have the relationships, and making sure, you can see lots of white space around there. And then as we read, either in set chapters or just as the students find things, I'll be directing them to come back and put some detail down. So as an example, I think it's from chapter 9, we get lots of information about Fredrik. So what I want from each of the characters, always remember to look at your notes if you've made notes, some physical and personal traits. as I said, I'm gearing up my students towards a creative writing piece, so I want them to be able to include some description, but not just the physical stuff, but we need some of it there. So he's a 17-year-old, he's the son of a farmer, good. He's freckled and ginger-haired, and how could I not quote this bit, as mottled as a sausage. So there's our description of him, there's our physical stuff. Now let's get maybe some more judgment about him, some of the real character traits about him. He got into moods, he was desperate to prove himself a man, he's a braggart and a show-off. He's got a hatred of Nathan and a desire to steal. So these are the things we all learned from chapter 9, or maybe chapter 8, about Friedrich. Which, if we want to use him in our intervention, our creative writing, then we've got a background to know about it. Also, he's a murderer, he's a convicted man. One of the things I'm really interested in is names, what other characters call each other. And this is, no, it's not from Agnes. I think this is from Nathan, who calls him that thieving boy. And that comes fairly early in our introduction to him. So we get a clear sense of the relationships, the judgments being made within the story that are going to help us as creative writers to make some judgments, or in our analytical writing to evaluate those judgments. And then I also want to quote to get them really focusing in on the language. And so the one I picked out was, Friedrich was raised in a household careless with morality. We get a little bit of his backstory, a little bit of sense that maybe he's the product of his context. But anyway, by the end of the novel, by the end of our reading, I would like to see notes for all the characters, not all in as such detail, but there's an example of the sorts of things we can pull out, and obviously most room for Agnes, because we're going to get lots of different things we learn about her that we need to juggle and try and balance before we make our final judgments, probably. All right, this is on your handouts. There's some highlighters on the tables as well if you want to play along. Now this is using one of our signature practices at Corinda. We've brought in heavily to reading to learn. I'm not going to model lots of that for you, but it's just designed to guide the students into a deeper reading, a close reading of a short text in particular, and one that they might otherwise miss some of the things in, or might be a bit beyond them. So we'd start with a preview. I'll give you a bit of an overview of what the text is. In this case, it's early on in chapter 1, where we get Bjorn Blondel, that local authority, visiting the farm where Agnes is going to stay to deliver the news. But mum and dad are out, it's only the daughters who are there. And then we do the detailed read, where I guide you through each of the sentences, and directing us what to highlight. So I'm just going to direct you what to highlight without the prompts, without the reading itself. Stena Jonsdottir was piling dried dung in the yard outside her family's turf croft when she heard the rapid clop of horses' hooves. Sorry, I do have a focus question here. What are the clues we get about the setting? Now, I've done this sort of activity previously with other novels. Of course, here's an extract. Where are the clues about the setting? And the success rate is very patchy. What I've found doing it this way, that I'm going to guide your reading about it, you'll get plenty of evidence, and then you'll be able to write something far more convincing and far more worthwhile. So what are the clues about the setting we get in here? Well, on that first line, it's the word dung. We could discuss that then. I mean, not so much what it means, but what it suggests to us, that she's piling dung. Not one of my regular weekend chores. I'd also get them to highlight the word croft and the word just before it, turf. It's a turf croft. I showed my class some pictures of turf-roofed houses yesterday, and they were blown away by that. But that's grass on a roof. How do they mow it? They let the sheep go up and graze. When she heard the rapid clop of horses' hooves. So there's my Horses, please, highlight that. We've got some of that sense of historical setting then. It's not the car, it's not the motorbike, it's not a plane, it's not a buzz of our iPhone in a pocket. It's the message is being delivered via someone riding a horse. In the next sentence, I'd want to highlight mud, skirts, pier, hovel, and riding track. And then we'll just do two more. In the next sentence, a man in a bright coat was approaching, bright red coat. She watched him turn towards the farm and, fighting a flicker of panic at the realisation she'd have to greet him. Flicker of panic. Retreated back around the croft where she hurriedly spat on her hands, spat, to clean them, and wiped her nose on her sleeve. Lovely. Wiped her nose on her sleeve. All right, things I'm trying to train my 4-year-old out of at the moment. It's just common practice for this woman who's in her late teens, about 19, I think, Steiner?
Yes,
in this chapter, I was actually really confused. I read them as being much younger children. Maybe it was because of the wiping the nose, I'm not sure. But I read Steiner and Lueger as being early teens at the oldest. But later on, we realised that they are actually young women. Anyway, the page would look something like this in the end. Now, I've only asked you to highlight. I could get you to distinguish between the different colours if we were going to spend a lot of time on this. And so what I've got is in yellow, I'm looking at my poverty, basically. That rural setting and that poor rural setting. So we've got the dung and the croft. Okay, that gives us something of just what life is like. But also the fact she's rubbing the mud off, so she's dirty constantly. And it's called a hovel. And the way she cleans is to spit on her hands and wipe her nose on her sleeve. These are not posh people. In green, then, I've got that historical sense, that historicity of, well, it's not just a croft, we can still have them, but this is a turf croft. Okay. They're pretty much museum pieces now. And it's the horses, as mentioned. Skirts. Now, hey, people still wear skirts, but this is where the language would be interesting for me. It's that plural. She's wearing more than one skirt. Okay. Not many of our kids do that with their school uniforms. But just try and get them that sense, even if they've got no idea what's going on yet, to build that visual picture. And the fact that it's a riding track. Then in the pink that I've got is my second point that I want to get out of this. What clues do we get about Blondel? He really doesn't fit in this scene of agrarian poverty. He comes in, well, on his horse, but lots of them have horses. His bright red coat. And her response is a flicker of panic. Now, she doesn't know him. We get that later on. Do you know who I am? Steiner shook her head. So it's not because she knows he's District Commissioner Bjorn Blondel. It's just that he's a person. And he's a man, and he's an adult, and he's obviously wearing some finery. And so it's that difference in the power relationships that I want to look at. And again, for creative writing, we're looking at that showing, not telling aspect of how we can build some depth into our characterization by looking at how Hannah Kent does it for us. I think that's all I wanted to do with that one. Once we've got this level of information, though, I could then ask my class, what clues do we get about the setting? And they'd be more able to produce a decent paragraph, or even start them with, a sentence stem. Hannah Kent shows the setting to be rural Iceland in the 19th century. Now, continue. Continue the paragraph, show me some evidence that you've picked and grouped together, and then explain how that shows what we're saying about the setting. And then obviously it's there, they've got that as a good detailed model for their own creative writing when they get to it, and the sorts of clues that they might want to drop in themselves. Okay. This is, I call it a vocabulary sieve. It's inductive reasoning. We're just looking at observations and building up to a pattern. I know this might be a bit of overkill or a bit of a blur. Don't worry if it is. What I like to do is, if we've read a passage, it might be that last passage or something similar. The evidence I'm taking here comes also from chapter 1, but a later scene when they're inside. And I just want them to, when they see something of interest, or it's a noun group or a key verb, to put it down. And this table could be much wider than 3 columns, but I've kept it at 3 because I know the important things I'm looking for. So I could either guide them, or we could make it broader and then let them see the visual evidence stack up what's more important. So my primary observations, there's skyr, which is Icelandic yogurt, which is really quite awesome. It's very thick, very hearty. It's now available in Woolies. There's a sheep bladder window. This is for me, this is the visual image of the novel that I can't shake. A sheep bladder window. And there's a letter. It's the letter that Blondel has given to Stena for her father to say Agnes needs to be staying with you. And then, we might have other things that don't match up with him, but as soon as they read something else that fits one of these categories, it goes into the secondary observations. So when we come to cream, or the mention of coffee in its absence, or milk, the broth of barley, the mutton, the smoked lamb, the blood sausage, the boil, obviously they're all food. This is a very food-centric chapter. They match up with the skyr. The sheep bladder window, there's also a dung fire, which I put in that same thing. I don't know whether it's animal products or just that sense of poverty. But, when I come to reading a sentence with dung fire, there's a noun group that I'm interested in. Does it match with food? No, thankfully. Does it match? I'll put it under the sheep bladder window. There's not necessarily a right or wrong, but we're just looking for the students to build a group of evidence before they put a title to it. And for them to reach their own conclusions, rather than me saying, right, find the evidence that says they're poor. The letter, this one doesn't work very well, I don't find, but I'm aiming for the historical era here. So it's a letter rather than an email or anything else. She's wearing an apron just as a regular thing, not because she's cooking at the moment, and she's wearing a shawl. And then I'd maybe find a name for what the category, or the students to find a name for what the categories are. So there's things about food, but the food's all fairly simple. Some of it sounds quite disgusting. Not as disgusting as the traditional Icelandic delicacy of the halkarl, the half-rotted shark that they bury in the earth for about 6 months and then dig it up after winter and eat it, and it's gone all kind of slimy. I don't think they eat it anymore either, but you can buy it in jars in souvenir shops and stuff, and I think they laugh at tourists who eat it.
Yeah, it's banned in restaurants and you can't eat it in public.
No, why? You shouldn't, no. The sheep bladder window, the dung fire, it's a rural setting, we've established that. It's pretty rough, but maybe these are resourceful people as well. They're using everything to get by, and they need to use everything to get by. And ye olden days. Can I find a pattern then? Do these things help me reach a consistent understanding of this chapter and the ideas that Hannah Kent is presenting? I'm going to suggest it's a fairly simple one. Just the idea. I don't want to labour the point. I don't want you to write it as a good sentence. They're poor 19th century farmers. That's what she's really hammering in this scene. From that, then, I could maybe write a better sentence, now that I've got my thinking out of the way. I guess this is what the activity is designed to do, is to do the reading and thinking and separate it from the writing. Because it's that nexus, obviously, that the students obviously fall down a lot on, of trying to go straight from the book to writing a good paragraph about it. And if they can synthesise internally, great, but many of them we need to teach them and practice these skills. So then maybe we could get to the family at Colnsau is hardworking and resourceful as they need to be to survive in the unforgiving environment of rural 19th century Iceland. Now that's a sentence I wouldn't expect from my students without a bit of scaffolding. But with the scaffolding, they can produce stuff like that quite simply. And then you can sort of flip this again. That can be your topic sentence, and we pick the evidence that we want. And we've got 3 different bits of evidence that we can show in the body of our paragraph to write something convincing and detailed, rather than just being stuck at one line, they're poor 19th century farmers. Voice. I don't know what I'm going to do with voice yet. I haven't got a prepared activity for it. We get several voices though. We get a lot of first-person reflection from Agnes, like in that prologue. We also get Agnes talking to Toti in third-person narration, but it's heavily from her perspective. We get other point-of-view characters as well in different scenes. She chops and changes a lot. And we also get a lot of objective third-person narration, and we get lots of letters and formal documents just to push the plot along. I'm not really sure what I want to do with it in terms of a structured activity, but I think I really want to go back and look at what Agnes says to Toti, her confessor. What she tells him versus what we know as objective fact. I'm not sure I can narrow that down to, a nice extract for each of them. I'll have to reread and scan some bits to find that. If I can, I'd love to do that, or maybe it's a post-reading activity for the students to bring what they know, what they can remember, what they can go back and find, just to see how much of the truth she's telling him or what version of it she's telling him versus what we know.
It occurs to me, David, this could potentially be a really important thing.
Yes.
Students writing their own narratives,
yes.
because you can show them how to write from different
yes.
points.
Yes. And that's the one that I'm definitely wanting to look at, is pick any 2 samples or 3 samples from the text and have a look at the voice in it, the choices of vocabulary, the choices of content, and see what's different when Hannah Kent's writing from Agnes's perspective or someone else's, or following this character, or the dialogue that they use, so that they can see some of the things they should do. It'll also be a great way to illustrate what not to do. I can see that students, we're going to do an intervention in this task. They're going to, I'll write a letter, because there's lots of them throughout the book, but the letters are actually really dull and don't give us any depth in it. She uses them really just as plot drivers to get through some factual stuff. Lots of good vocab. I've got 10 minutes. It's 5 past, it said.
If you want questions.
Right, yes. Do whatever you like with the vocab. There's plenty of rich stuff in there. That's just my sample of, different chapters have different levels of vocabulary that are available or interested in looking at. So, chapter 7 is a ripper, so is chapter 1. Some of the others are fairly straightforward. Similar to what I did with the character map. There's the physical map, it's there in the book, scan a copy of it, get them to identify different places and the language used to describe it. So, Cornsow, early on, Agnes lives with Margaret's family, just factual summary of why that place is important, and then a quote. You can read that at your leisure. It's described as a fairly nice place. This is Jon and Margaret coming home for the first time and seeing it, and it is a homecoming, so it's a nice place for them. Storeborg, where Agnes is kept as a prisoner before she goes to Cornsow. After months in a room filled with only my own fetid breath and the stench from the chamber pot, I was taken through the corridors of Storeborg into the muddy yard. And it was raining. Just those little choices, there's nothing super sophisticated about the language choices in there, but putting them together, we get the mood, we get the vibe. Lugastata is where Nathan's home is and where he is killed. The sea was blank. Nathan pushed the boat along its silvered skin, plunged his oars in its side. And the light arrived like a hunted thing, all wide-eyed and trembling. We get that emotional sense from the places. And the setting is so important in this novel. It's really an independent character that the students could be working with. Right, we don't really have time to do this one. Trigger objects is just where we take a thing and use it to write a little bit about. So in this extract, which is on the handouts there, Blondel scraped back his chair and rose to stand next to her at the window, ignoring Stainer. He peered out through the dried sheep's bladder that had been pulled across to serve as a pane. Fine, there's an idea. Obviously, Hannah Kent has heard that they used that, but then she's given us some richer description there, noticing a small vein twisted in its dull surface. He shuddered. His own house had glass windows. So this is a passage, and it's a nice short one. This is a great example of what we can do. We could go through and just highlight again or otherwise split it up. Identify what she has put together. Blondel, person, scraped back his chair, action, rose to stand next to her, action, and then the object, the window, and so on. Each element of that we can break up, identify what it's doing, and then we can rewrite. So I could show my version of it, which if you know the novel, and once you've done the deconstruction part of it, it's fairly simple. It's a jigsaw. It doesn't have to be great literature as a model or in your first class activity, but it shows the students how you can use the sentence patterns of the novel, which are so rich. Agnes, instead of Blondel, pushed back her hair and walked towards the horse. A reaction smiling at Nathan. just following every sample, every piece of structure there in those sentences, and then we get to the reactions at the end. She sighed. She would never know the freedom of running across the hills. And really what I think she does so well, Hannah Kent, in this novel is takes these objects, takes these bits of setting and then links them to these emotional responses from her characters. And that's what I really want my students to be working on. If they can produce that sort of thing in their own creative writing, then they'll be doing very well. Actually, just give them a bit of help and a bit of scaffolding to get there. I was going to get you to do some, but we don't have time. Figurative language, there are lots of good examples, starting with the candle flames right from the prologue. What I would do, I've done this several times, it works quite well for students who are not particularly creative, is to write, let's find 6, 10, whatever, concrete nouns from the novel. I could give them to you, or you could find them as students. The dung fire, the sheep ladder window, horse, knife, skier, manacles, good. And then I'll give you 6 abstract nouns from our vocabulary list. And then we use the props. Would you be so kind? Would you be so kind? Just roll them. From our first column, we're going to choose number 3. We're going to choose both 3s. The horse. Oh, the horse is chastisement. I don't know how the horse is going to chastise her. This activity puts you on the spot a little bit as the teacher to try and model that. Or you can just say, no, it's your job, kids. You just do it. I'd maybe prepare a couple in advance when I do this so I can get some awkward combinations or some obvious ones. But we can start to see how Hannah Kent works with these sorts of things and how you can build a metaphor out of almost nothing, just the ingredients that are there in the novel. Some alternatives. Obviously, this could lead us to a feature article on capital punishment is the one that jumped out at me straight away. We've just finished feature articles. The novel really can help us explore those issues of what obligations society has to its criminals. You know, can we kill them? Is that allowed? Should we kill them nicely? Should we be friendly to them? Give them a year to repent beforehand, whatever it might be, and then could lead into some interesting discussion there. It's also going to work quite nicely for a companion to films for analysis, for a comparison. Particularly for me, I'm thinking films that are heavily reliant on setting. So we can look at how settings are super important in Burial Rites versus, I don't know, the setting in Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. And they can be very different styles of story and very different moods, but still use that central idea of the setting influencing everything, not just being a place where things happen. Companion reading, I brought a pile just because I like to show off my books. This one in particular I'm finding really useful, Sagaland. It's a new release last year by Richard Feidler from the ABC and Kari Gislason, who's a Brisbane academic and writer. And they talk a bit about Iceland and talk a bit about some of the sagas, just picking out some of the key bits. So if you're not actually going to delve into the 13th century sagas yourself, which you should at some time, I highly recommend them, Sagaland will give you a nice little snapshot summary of some of them, some of the key moments, including Gudrun from Laxdale Saga, who says, I was worst to the one that I loved best. I've got to go back and read the Little Book of Icelanders in the old days. I think we might find some nice folklore issues in there, or little stories, odd things about what happened in the countryside that might provide, it's light-hearted, but might provide some stimulus for them to write as well and to engage in that setting. I know we've got 5 minutes left if you want to ask any questions. Sorry for skipping through some of that. I've tried to pull together everything I'm planning for my unit ahead. I wasn't sure how much we'd get through in the hour.
I'm going to do a little bit of thanking, and that way we can get as many questions as we can. Is that okay? So, Dan, I would like to thank you so much for doing this. If you are hot in the room, you'll be so jealous of me right now. It is a testament to how good and generous Dan is about this stuff that there are 1, 2, 3 Corinda teachers here who could easily have gone to another session because they can get access to Dan anytime, but they knew that this would be very much worth their while. Look, now I'm all excited about teaching burial rites. You know, I'm trepidatious about how dark it is, but it's such a wonderful sort of a story, and now I've got all sorts of good ideas about how I might go ahead. My goodness, with teaching for burial rites, but really for teaching my my next unit of work in English. I think I'm really excited about that. You made me think about what Lisa Bottomley said about the connection between what we read and how we then go ahead and write ourselves, whether that assessment is indeed a narrative, so it's in the same genre as the one we're studying, or whether we need to change our gear and look at expository task. So thank you very much. Thank you very much. You get this most excellent ETAC brolly, which I know. And so wear that one in good health. Can I throw 2 questions now that you're comfortable?
I'm liking the book, but I teach the ALD, and I'm wondering how those kids are going to handle it, specifically with spelling of the places of the characters. If you don't understand, you've got to talk about sentences, you've got to talk about some different things where you have to use those words. Are they going to catch on, or are they going to struggle?
That's an interesting one. Given that so much of it is the different letters, you know, I don't think you could mark them down for it, could you? You know, if you write beyond London, you don't put the little unless at the top. I mean, who cares? Would be my default setting. I'm just trying to think, you know, similar to how a lot of QCS short responses mark, you know, where for a lot of those questions they don't care about the sentence structure or the spelling, it's the content of the ideas. I would hope that's the case here. Obviously, they'll need to write connected prose to answer in that. It's going to be a challenge. I think there's no doubt about that.
Yeah, because there's enough content there.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know, maybe that's just one of those things of a lot of repetition, things you maybe wouldn't think so much for a senior English class, but like I would do with a junior maths class, I'm going to have those words on the wall constantly, that practice and that exposure. Can I have an easy question?
I think this is a really great session. How long would you anticipate that you do all the pre-reading activities for? Like 1 week class, 2 weeks?
I'm thinking about a week, yeah.
And is that while they're reading the book at home?
After the first lesson, yes.
Okay.
I think we'll even try and read some of it each lesson, I think, but just that introduction.
How long would you anticipate that it will take the students to get through reading the book?
I'm setting them 30 pages a lesson,
Okay.
so it's going to be 12 lessons, so 4 weeks.
Okay.
Do you have any hesitations about teaching the book?
Yep.
On the grade stuff, or what's the advice?
I think it's really good in extract. I love it. You know, I can find page after page that I'm going to just really enjoy teaching. I think the overall structure at times it's not necessarily as coherent as it could be, or as easy for the children, and it's not so much a sophisticated, challenging structure for them as just a bit confusing, almost for its own sake, I think. And The Quiet American by Graham Greene has split narrative timelines as well, and that's a challenge, but I think it's worthwhile. This one, particularly the jumping around with the voices and the letters in there, they drag a bit, I think. So that, for me, is going to be one of the challenges, to keep that coherence and narrative push while the kids are reading.